Okay, welcome back to part 2 of the 2019 CSQ1 lecture. So for this lecture, we will go through question F in depth. So in the previous lecture, we covered what we would require in the part F of this question. And now, before we start writing the essay, let's try and look through the extracts to see if there are any relevant information that we can find which can help us answer the question better. So I'll give you about 10 seconds, maybe you all look through the extract. Okay, so let's just look through the extracts briefly, okay? So when I look through the extract, right, I always look at the names of the extract first, because this gives me an idea about what the extracts will be talking about. So because I want to look at the effects, specifically I want to look at EFP from France, I realize that this is most likely going to be the most important part of the extract for me, right? So when I look through France, but then before that, we realize that here they also talk about the economic impact of tourism. So maybe we can have a little bit of clue as to how tourism can benefit the country first. So I just briefly run through the extract. You see, here they will talk about how the tourism industry is actually quite resistant, quite strong, quite resilient. And here we see travel and tourism industry creates jobs, drives exports, and generates prosperity across the world. So I have an idea of what tourism does. So this one just gives me an example of how well tourism does it. So not as important. The graphs, not as important. I look at the individual cases. I won't read through Singapore's because I want to focus straight away on France. Okay? So when it comes to France, right, let's read through the extract. France is the world's most popular tourist destination, but 2016 was a disaster for the French tourist industry, where visits fell by over 8% compared with 2015. The number of nights spent in hotels in Paris in 2016 was as much as 21% lower. The decision by the United Kingdom to leave the EU has not helped, since it is France's second biggest source of foreign visitors, and the fall in value of the pound sterling after Brexit meant visits to France has become more expensive for UK citizens. So this one, I can infer what they're trying to say is that there has been a fall in tourism. But terrorism is the main reason for the falling numbers. So here, right, we see terrorism, and then we look back at the question. You see, the government is trying to use G to reduce the likelihood of terrorist incidents. So from here, right, we can see why. Because terrorism is the main reason for France's falling tourist numbers. Several recent atrocities that claimed hundreds of innocent lives have made Asians in particular wary of visiting France. Thus, while arrivals from the UK are down by 4%, arrivals from Japan and China are down by 40% and 23% respectively. So this is just a study. It just shows how tourists react to different events that happen in a country. The France government is spending money on measures to reduce the likelihood of terrorist attacks so that France is seen as a safe place to visit, work, and invest. So here, we see, what do we see here? We see that this is the kind of the purpose behind them wanting to tackle the terrorist incidents. They want to make France feel more like a safe place to visit, work, and invest. So we look about it. The government expenditure is to reduce the likelihood of terrorist incidents, which is in turn meant to do this for the France economy. Okay? So when I say safe place to visit, work, and invest, the first few things I think of straight away are when they're safe, maybe more stable. I'm thinking of things like consumer and investor confidence. when it comes to stability. So this is just something that we will think about. And then here, they say the hope in France is that government's efforts to prevent future attacks will be successful. So this one, it may not seem very relevant to the question at first glance, but you realize this means that there is some level of uncertainty over the success of the government expenditure, right? The French government is increasing their government expenditure to reduce likelihood of terrorist incidents, but they don't know for sure whether or not it's going to work or not. So maybe this can be something that we can evaluate later on, right? So let's go back to the question. Now, with the knowledge that we've gained from this extract, right, maybe you can look through this and I'll give you about 5 seconds. Maybe you think about your 2 key arguments that you want to write for this question. Okay, that's about 5 seconds. So when we looked at this question, right, you realize that from the extract, they don't give you much impact. They don't directly link you to a macro goal that they want you to talk about. So we will largely have to do it based on what we're comfortable with or what we're familiar with. So for my key argument 1, right, I would straight away say that the increased government expenditure is likely going to lead to an increase in actual economic growth and a fall in demand deficient unemployment. Right? This is purely from theory, from what we know about expansionary fiscal policy. So you see this 6 marks of content here, right? You realize that I can actually attain a lot of the 6 marks from here just by providing a very layered, a very structured analysis of how expansionary fiscal policy leads to this. And these are things that we have already practiced before. So when we draw the graph, maybe let's say assuming there was spare capacity, so let's say I draw GPL 0. Let's say initially AD was here, then after that there'll be a multiplied rise, right? AD1, then AD2, and AD3. And we must remember to label our YF. So I have Y, Y1, Y2, and Y3. So how I would argue this, right? I would say that an increase in government expenditure would lead to a direct increase in AD because G is a component of AD. Furthermore, right, if the government expenditure, the increase in government expenditure to reduce likelihood of terrorist incidents is successful, you realize that this will make France, as we discussed just now, a safer place to work, visit, and invest. So this we got it from the extract. So we are quoting the extract. So this would tell us that if it is successful, the stability and the security of France will improve. France will become a more stable, a more secure, a safer place for people to visit, people to work, people to do whatever. And because of this, right, you realize that maybe because it's a safer place to work, maybe France would become more attractive to tourists. Because, I mean, when you're traveling overseas, who doesn't want to feel safe, right? Will you go to a country where you know there are a lot of terrorist attacks or you don't even know if you'll be able to make it back? No, right? So because of this increased stability, the demand for maybe their tourism-related goods will increase. So we'll go step by step. Because it's a safer place to visit, there's an increase in attractiveness as a tourist location. right? And because of this, there will be an increase in the volume of tourism. This will lead to the demand of tourism related goods and services to increase. And you realize that because you're selling these tourism related goods and services to tourists who are actually not part of your country's economy, right? We consider it more of an export. So this will lead to a rise in export revenue. Okay? And the next one, we look at this same extract that we quoted, right? Because it's a safer place to invest, right? The added stability will likely improve the expected profitability of firms. Why? Because their profits are a lot less uncertain now, right? I don't have to worry whether or not my company will be, I don't know, maybe attacked by a terrorist group. I'm not afraid whether or not my capital goods, my machinery will be blown into bits during a terrorist incident. So my expected profitability would likely increase, and this would attract more foreign direct investment, which would lead to an increase in I. So I think some of you may have the question now, right? Why is it not sufficient to say that increase in G leads to an increase in AD? Theoretically speaking, right, an increase in G is more than enough to trigger the multiplier effect in our ADAS diagram, correct? Because it leads to an increase in AD straight away. So why go through the trouble of increasing export revenue and increasing investment expenditure? The issue here is you realize that if I just talk about G alone, I do not engage the extract at all, right? I take nothing from the extract. And as far as possible, right, when Cambridge gives us an extract, they want us to use it. So we are actually looking for ways to incorporate what Cambridge has given us into our answers, so that it seems that we did not just memorize, our answers are not purely rehearsed or memorized, but there's also an active sort of close reading into analyzing what each of the extracts are saying. So from here, there's an increase in G, there's an increase in X, and there's an increase in I. Assuming import expenditure remains the same, right? When GXI increases, AD will increase. Assuming that France had spare capacity to begin with, this will lead to the upward multiplier effect. Upward multiplier effect. So you explain the upward multiplier effect. So initially there will be a shift from AD to AD1 due to the increase in G, I, and X. And then after that, due to that, there will be a fall. There will be an unplanned fall in inventories, blah blah blah, leading to multiple rounds of income-induced consumption due to the initial rise in AD. And then you say overall AD will shift from AD to the endpoint, and national income rises from Y to the last income that we get. So here, right, when there's a rise in national income, we can conclude that hence there will be actual economic growth brought about due to the increase in the government expenditure here. Secondly, when I look at the graph, right, you realize initially my output gap, which is the gap between my full employment and where my economy is at, is actually YF minus Y units. But because it is now smaller, my new output gap is now YF minus Y3 units. you realize that my output gap has decreased in size. The decrease in size is Y3 minus Y units. And this reflects a fall in demand deficient unemployment. In the French economy. So you see, right, I know my start point is a rise in G, and I know my end point is as many macro goals as I can hit. So here, I try to hit two, right? I try to hit economic growth and low unemployment. So this paragraph by itself, this would be more than sufficient. I've used the case extract here. I've explained the theoretical analysis of increase in G, and I've linked it to the multiplier, and lastly I've linked it to my endpoint, which is actual economic growth and fall in demand deficient unemployment. Now the question a lot of people may have is, do I need to write the full multiplier effect? The answer is no. You do not need to write the full, maybe like 3-4 cycles of multiplier effect, for the very simple reason, right? You have 2 body paragraphs, 2 key arguments, right? And you only have 6 marks for content. You think about it, right? If you write the whole multiplier effect for 6 marks for 1 paragraph, not only do you not have time to finish the rest of the essay, your essay would probably seem a little bit lopsided, in the sense your paragraph 1 will be much longer than your paragraph 2. So you just need to draw the essence of the multiplier effect. Whether or not we need to explain the multiplier effect in full and in a few cycles, that one really depends on the question. If the question is maybe like, explain how a rise in government expenditure can lead to a multiplied rise in national income, and then you see very clearly, right, the only thing we are talking about is a multiplied rise in national income. And because this is our endpoint, in that theoretical question, we would have to explain the upward multiplier effect in full. But because we don't need to, we don't have to really do it. And then if you still have time after this and you want to develop this paragraph even further, right, you realize that when I increase my investment expenditure, what will happen? When I increase my investment expenditure, right, so this is good if you can write it, if you have the time, but if you don't have the time, I think sticking to what we've already discussed is more than sufficient. So if when I increase my investment, okay, let's say there is a shift of my AD, I won't draw a multiplied shift, but there's a shift in my AD, right? You realize if I increase my investment and they invest in capital stock, assuming the rate of capital accumulation is greater than the rate of capital depreciation, this will lead to an increase in capital stock in the country. Right? And because I have more capital stock, that will also lead to an increase in productive capacity. And this is reflected by a increase in the long run AS, which is just a rightward shift of the vertical portion of the AS. So you see now our YF changes. And then there's also this. So you see, right, not only does the increase in government expenditure lead to fall in demand deficient unemployment and actual economic growth, you realize you can also argue that it leads to potential economic growth. And if you want to conclude, when we have actual economic growth and potential economic growth, we will naturally have sustained economic growth. So this is for the first paragraph. For the second paragraph, oh no, I'm running out of space. I'll erase this first. for the second paragraph, I want to look at a negative impact. And you realize the extracts are not very helpful in terms of the negative impacts. They didn't really give us much, right? So we have to think about what we can work with. So we studied before, right, in our notes, that expansionary fiscal policies could lead to unintended negative consequences. Unintended negative consequences for the economy due to the increase in G. So due to increase in G. Right? So what kind of unintended negative consequences might there be? You realize here, right, a very big thing we did in this diagram, we assumed excess spare capacity. Right? We also assume that, oh, because it's safer, then immediately they would invest more, they would consume more, everything. But this might not be true, right? If let's say, let me draw another ADS diagram. If let's say initially the French economy was producing here. Oh, I realized I forgot to label my price. Okay, never mind. So if let's say the GPR was here to begin with, let's say here, YF, you realize this injection by the government would actually lead to a rise in general price levels for the economy, right? So now here we assume excess spare capacity. So now here what we say is, if the economy was producing near full capacity or near full employment, producing near full capacity, the additional government expenditure could actually lead to inflationary pressures. But when we write our econs essays, right, we must be very precise. Econs in itself is a very precise endeavor, right? You must state not just inflationary pressure, but specifically demand pull inflationary pressure, as reflected by the rise in GPR from P to P1. Okay? So, especially because we talked about in key argument 1, right? Increase in G, increase in X, increase in I. There's likely going to be a large increase in AD. So even if let's say it was here, right? Such a large initial increase in AD could bring it all the way here already, which would also lead to an increase in GPL. There's one possible unintended negative consequence, right? Which is demand pull inflation. The second one that we are familiar with when we're studying is that when I increase my G, right, the government expenditure has to come out of somebody's pocket, and it's coming out from the government's budget, which means that when I increase my government expenditure, it could actually worsen my budget position for France. So why is that an issue? If let's say my budget position to begin with was not very good, right? To increase G, if I have to, maybe let's say if government had to borrow to increase in G, right? It could lead to the crowding out effect. So this crowding out effect, be it anytime you talk about expansionary fiscal policy, this is a very important thing that we need to remember. Why crowding out effect? Let's say, right, I have a market for loanable funds. So I have the market for loanable funds. Yes. You realize that, okay, maybe initially the equilibrium is at here. If let's say my government is borrowing to invest, right? You realize that, okay, this is not exactly price and quantity lah. So I'll just leave the axis there first. I'll just illustrate the diagram to you. let's say if there's that it could lead to an increase in demand for loanable funds. So your interest rate, right? So never mind, ignore that first. Increase in demand for my loanable funds. So this will lead to what? Higher interest rate, right? Higher price for my loanable funds. So you realize that for me to borrow funds, the cost that I'm paying is literally just the interest rate. If you think about it, if you lend me $500, I pay you back $600. I actually paid you $100 for $500, and that extra $100 is likely to be calculated or accrued through interest. So when the demand for loanable funds increase, you realize, right, there's likely going to be so this one will lead to an increase in demand for loanable funds. It's likely going to lead to an increase in interest rates for borrowing, as we illustrated in the graph, right? And when there's an increase in interest rate, it means what? Cost of borrowing increases. And we learn, right, that for firms who are looking to invest, their marginal cost, their cost would be the cost of borrowing to invest, right? So when there's an increase in interest rate, you realize that the MC of investing for firms increases. And assuming that MB stays constant, right, this increase in interest rate would crowd out private investment. Because let's say assuming MC increase and MB stay constant, so initially equilibrium is that MB equals to MC, assuming that MB is constant, right, and MC increase, now MB is less than MC, so you realize your firms will invest less, and this means that because of this, investment would fall. So you realize that there's an increase in G, but there's a fall in investment expenditure. This fall in investment expenditure would mitigate the effects of a rise in G, making it less effective, limiting its effectiveness, right? So from here, right, a very common mistake that people might have for this question, or rather for the key argument 2, right, when they look at likely impact, they would think that their key argument 2 maybe, they would say, can we write about limitations of EFP specifically? So I give you an example of one, okay? Maybe small multiplier, for example. Oh, what's that? Small multiplier. And the answer is you should try not to. Why? For the very simple reason, right? When I talk about the limitations of my expansionary fiscal policy, it doesn't talk about a negative impact per se. It just talks about a limited positive impact. So here, instead of my key argument 1, key argument 2, right, would evolve into positive impact and limited positive impact. And this would form the structure of my essay. And you realize that in this, right, I literally do not talk about the negative impacts of this increase in government expenditure at all. And if I don't talk about the negative impacts, right, considering this is a higher order thinking question, you realize that there will be zero or little to no balance. So we would try to focus on positive and negative, the negative one like here we said. So you see, even for a negative impact, right, we link back to one of the macro goals, price stability. And we would say that it's not good for price stability. And then lastly, so positive, negative, very clear cut. Nobody is going to argue with me that demand pull inflation leading to a rise in general price levels is a limited positive impact and not a negative impact, because it by definition goes against one of our 4 macro goals. So now, when it comes to evaluation, when I look at evaluation for this 8-mark question, it's not very long because it's just 2 marks, right? It's a 2-mark evaluation, so I have A, T, M, S. I would pick the easiest one, always the easiest one. And for this case, the easiest one would seem to be T, time frame. Why? Because you realize that in the short run, the government expenditure in trying to reduce the terrorism attacks may not be very successful or may not bear fruit at all. But in the long run, if it is successful, there will definitely be a major boost in consumer and business confidence, right? So what I would say here is, I'll make my stand first. So I would say that the increase, so the question, we have to answer the question, I discuss the likely impact, so I need to talk about the likely impact. So the increase in government expenditure is likely going to lead to a increase in AD, but the extent of actual economic growth and fall in demand deficient unemployment is likely to be small. So here I make a claim, right? I need to explain why. Okay? You must always justify the claims you make in your evaluation. Why? For the very simple reason, so I use some contextual knowledge, right? Because France as a country is already experiencing budget deficits. So you see, I bring in the context of France very specifically for my evaluation. When it comes to evaluation, you must evaluate to the context as best as possible. Here, the context they give you is France, so evaluate in terms of France. Okay? Using contextual knowledge, France is likely to already be facing budget deficits, hence they would likely be borrowing to finance the increased G. And as we discussed in our key argument 2, right, this would lead to a crowding out effect. However, so we see, right, in the short run, there's likely to be a small benefit for the economy on balance. However, on balance, right, in the long run, if terrorist incidents really go down, you realize that the safety and security of France will increase greatly. And this will likely boost consumer and business confidence greatly. So because of this, when there's a boost in consumer and business confidence, there will likely be a significant increase in CNI, right? Which will lead to a much larger increase in actual economic growth and unemployment. And if you brought in potential economic growth with investments, you can also link it here. And hence, in the long run, the government's decision to increase their government expenditure to deal with the terrorist incidents will likely be very beneficial to the macroeconomy. Right? That's one thing. Another thing is, you realize consumer and business confidence at its core, right? Who runs these things? We are all what? We're all humans, right? Just because the government tells us, hey, I'm going to reduce the likelihood of terrorist incidents, you are not going to buy that instantly and say, oh, okay, then I'll increase my C, I'll increase my I. No, right? You will have to wait and see. Maybe you will watch the news, maybe you will look at updates from France and see whether or not it really is safe, or whether or not it's really more stable before you feel emboldened to increase your consumer expenditure or your business expenditure or your investment expenditure, right? So because they would likely have to wait and see, this would also mean that it takes time. And hence, most of the benefits are likely realized in the long run. Okay, so this is a bit lengthier because there's really quite a fair bit of content to go through in this question. So that's all for the part 2 of the lecture, and for the next lecture I'll do part G of the CSQ1. Okay, thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next lecture.